Memorial Quilt. He also helped create the San Francisco AIDS Foundation, one of the first organizations established in response to the AIDS epidemic. Mr. Jones has since dedicated himself to promote AIDS awareness among people all over the country. Before I let him come up here and talk to you, I'd like to remind you that we have our AIDS Response Fund baskets outside. If you could make a donation, we'd appreciate it. It goes towards helping people on campus who are affected by the HIV virus. The basket will be outside right now, and it'll be back at the end of the program. Well, without any more delay, here's Mr. Cleve Jones.
Thank you. Well, I feel a little silly being up here in this enormous room. The fellows that picked me up at the airport said they were expecting hundreds. I was expecting 80, and I think we were both a little low. But I'm glad to be here and to see so many of my friends from Washington, D.C., who are very generous to be here because they've already heard my speech many times. I'm not a politician. I'm not a scientist. I assume all of you have already educated yourselves about HIV and AIDS and how it is transmitted and how it can be prevented. I'm really here just to tell the story of the quilt and my own experience in starting the quilt. And in particular, I want to share some things that happened in my life that I think are of interest to you because they were not unique experiences to me, but experiences that are shared by many people. Really, the story of the quilt begins in the early 1950s when my great-grandmother, named Irene Rupert, in Brazil, Indiana, began to sew together a series of quilts that would be passed on to her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I wasn't born yet, and my family is all from southern Indiana, rural Indiana, and I grew up hearing the stories of our Hoosier family and the values of the Midwest, the pioneer spirit. About the same time that my great-grandmother was sewing quilts in southern Indiana, a man named Harvey Milk was getting kicked out of the U.S. Navy for being gay. He would eventually find his way to New York and then to San Francisco. I was born in 1954 in Indiana, and my parents moved around a lot. They were graduate students when I was a kid, and they settled in Phoenix. When I got out of high school, I knew I was gay, and like so many gay kids in the late 60s and early 70s, I stuck out my thumb and hitchhiked to San Francisco. Shortly after I got there, I met Harvey Milk on the corner of Castro Street, which is the center of the gay community, and got involved in his campaigns. It seemed he was running for supervisor every single year, and every year he came a little bit closer. And in 1977, he was elected and was the first openly gay person elected to office in California. And I had the privilege of working in his office as a student intern while studying in the Urban Studies Department at San Francisco State. Harvey was murdered on November 27th, 1978, along with the mayor of San Francisco, George Moscone, by a former police officer and politician named Dan White. I was in City Hall the day of the murders, was one of the people who found Harvey's body. And I was really devastated by it because at the time, I was still estranged from my own family. My mom and dad had a lot of trouble at first accepting the fact that I was gay. And Harvey was sort of a father figure. He was a very funny man, pushy New York Jewish guy, and he had lived a very interesting life and had a lot of opinions and no hesitancy to express them. And he was a remarkable man. And when I saw him lying there and saw the blood, it seemed to me that everything had been taken away. And out of that sense of grief and really inexpressible loss, a group of us decided to organize a Candlelight March. And I imagine many of you have seen the footage that exists of that march. But as word of the murders spread throughout San Francisco, thousands and then tens of thousands of people gathered on the corner of Castro and Market Street with their candles. They were gay and they were straight. They were people of every race and background who shared the progressive political ideals of Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk. And we gathered there. It was a cold night. And we marched about 50,000 strong down Market Street to San Francisco City Hall, and we left our candles there. And I remember vividly that night standing among this sea of people, most of whom were strangers, and promising to myself that I would do whatever I could to keep the memory of Harvey Milk alive and help other people understand the political principles that he advocated, and to also understand the community, the new community that he represented so well in his short period of leadership. And so my friends and I, every year since, on November 27th, have organized a Candlelight March in San Francisco. And every year I've gone around with the posters and the staple gun and put up the notices on the telephone poles in the neighborhoods. And in 1985, my friend Joseph Durant and I were walking up and down Castro Street putting up posters a few days before the Candlelight March. And we happened to pick up a copy of the San Francisco Chronicle. And there we read on the front page that 1,000 San Franciscans had already been killed by the new epidemic. I was really struck by that figure because I had started the San Francisco AIDS Foundation and thus was there for that whole first wave of people who came through our doors. At that time, there was very, very little that we could offer them except support and friendship. There was absolutely no hope. There was no treatment on the horizon at all. And people died much faster then because we didn't know as much about combating the opportunistic infections that affect people with HIV. I was also struck by the fact that of those 1,000 who had died, the vast majority of them were gay men who had lived and died within a 10-block radius of where I was standing at Castro and Market with my friend Joseph. And I remember saying to Joseph that we were really standing at ground zero of a tragedy that was spreading very, very rapidly beyond our borders. But there was no evidence. And I remember saying to Joseph, I don't know how many of you have been to Castro Street from the looks of the crowd. Some of you have already been there. But it's a very beautiful neighborhood with lots of Victorians that have been restored. There's lots of shops and bars and cafes and restaurants and bookstores. There's almost always people on the street shopping. It's a fun, lively neighborhood. But when I walk down Castro Street, I know that this is where Bill died. This is where Henry died. This is where George committed suicide after his diagnosis. This is the building from which Freddie was evicted when his landlord found out. And I was just sort of getting a little obsessive about how this incredible tragedy was unfolding, but there was no evidence, nothing that people could look at and see and understand. And I said to Joseph, if this were a meadow with 1,000 corpses lying in the sun, then people would look, they would see, they would understand, and if they were human beings, they would be compelled to respond. But there was no such evidence. And Joseph and I talked about it for a while, and a couple days later, as people began to gather for the Candlelight March to remember Harvey and George, we had big stacks of poster board and baskets of magic markers. And as the marchers arrived, we asked everybody to stop for a minute and take the time to write down the name of one person they knew who had died of AIDS. And first hundreds and then thousands of people made these signs, and most of them just said Bill or Tom or my brother. And people walked in silence, and we carried our candles to City Hall, as we always do. And we left them there for Harvey and George. And then I asked everybody to walk another 2 blocks. And we went to the San Francisco Federal Building, which is a big gray stone building on United Nations Plaza. And I had hidden extension ladders in the shrubbery around the building. And as the marchers arrived, we placed the ladders up against the Federal Building and got big rolls of tape, and we climbed up, and we covered the whole front facade of this building, 3 stories up, with the names of our dead friends. It was a startling image, a cold night, drizzly, and people stood there for a very long time in almost complete silence and read these names. And as I walked through the crowd and caught the little pieces of conversation that people were having, I realized that many people were learning for the first time what had happened to the guy they went dancing with, to their old roommate from college, to a neighbor, a friend, a former boyfriend. And I was really struck by the need, the overwhelming, yearning need that I felt among these people to find a way to express not only our grief and our loss and to find a way to remember these people, but also to try and communicate beyond our neighborhood, beyond our city, to the rest of the world. Because while a great many people have been very blind and very stupid, we were not. And we knew what was going to come. And as I stood there in the crowd and looked at this patchwork of names up on the wall, I thought to myself it looked like a quilt. And when I said the word quilt to myself, I was immediately flooded with memories of my grandmother and my great-grandmother and the quilts that she sewed in southern Indiana before I was born, and in particular one quilt which ended up being my quilt. It was a perfect quilt for a little boy because it had unicorns on it and totem poles on it. I don't know where she got this fabric. It was some crazy person's pajamas, probably. But I remember as a child, whenever I was sick or tired, Grandma or my mom would bring out this quilt, and I'd lie down on the sofa and trace the images of this quilt with my fingers. And as I thought of it, I thought, well, what a warm, comforting, middle-class, middle American, non-threatening, traditional sort of symbol. And maybe this is the symbol then we should match with this disease that's killing homosexuals and African American women and children and drug addicts and other people that our society has still not yet come to fully value. And that was the idea. I thought, that's a pretty good idea. I didn't do anything about it for a very long time, though. That was November 27th, 1985, and we didn't actually start the quilt until the spring of '87, mainly because I was preoccupied with, life. But I spent a lot of time thinking about it. And during that time, there were three things that happened to me. And again, I share these experiences with you, not because they are unique to me, but because unfortunately these are experiences shared by a great many people and a growing number of people. The first was, I had been, like all conscientious homosexuals in San Francisco, I had early on signed up for the blood studies that were going on as the scientists were trying to track the disease. So I knew that the health department had samples of my blood. They in fact had samples going back to 1978 because I had also participated in the hepatitis studies of the late 70s. And I had never asked them whether I was HIV positive. And I think today we forget how long we had to operate without any information at all. But in 1984, there was very little reason for me to find out whether I was HIV positive or not because there was nothing to be done about it. But by 1985, it was beginning to change. 86, there was a little bit more progress, a few little tiny glimmers of maybe some hope. None of them panned out. But I decided that I would find out. And I called up the clinic and said, this is Cleve Jones calling, and I want to find out whether I'm HIV positive or not. And they said, we can't give you that information over the phone. And, but let me put you on hold for a minute. And then Dr. Stempel came on, who was an old friend of mine. He said, I'd like to take you out to lunch. So I knew right then I probably wasn't going to get a free lunch out of this if it was good news. And I think none of us really understand how much hope we have harbored deep inside until you get that word. And he asked me, well, what do you think? And I said, I think I've got it. And he said, you're right. And at that point, I really did feel that my life was over. I love being gay. I love being part of the gay liberation movement in San Francisco. It's been an extraordinary experience for me with wonderful people and really magnificent romantic adventures. And it seemed that all of that immediately was gone. That love and work, friendship, all of these were going to be taken. And I got very depressed and felt sorry for myself. But I also was broke and I had to get a job. And I ended up moving to Sacramento, which is the capital of California, and working as a lobbyist for the Friends Committee on Legislation, which is a Quaker-sponsored social justice advocacy group. I was raised Quaker. And During that period, I got a telephone call from Mike Wallace at 60 Minutes, and he said that he'd seen a videotape of the speech that I had given on the steps of San Francisco City Hall, and he wanted to come and interview me. And I was a little bit nervous about this because I thought he was sort of a right-wing jerk, and I didn't really, I wasn't too impressed, but he came out to San Francisco and spent 3 days with me, and I took him all over the city, and I showed him how, in the complete vacuum of any sort of organized government response, individual citizens, everyday folks, were creating the systems necessary to care for people with HIV, to educate young people, to try and force the government to allocate the money necessary. And they ended up doing a really fine piece. It was called Life and Death in San Francisco, and really focused on the service needs that were so desperately underfunded at that time. The only trouble was the 60 Minutes program was aired right after I moved to Sacramento, and I had just rented an apartment, and my telephone number and my address were both now available through directory assistance. And when the 60 Minutes piece aired, the Sacramento newspapers did just a little tiny article about this famous homo that was now living in Sacramento, and the death threats began the next morning. I don't know how many of you have ever received a death threat over the telephone. It's kind of irritating. And especially when it happens at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm really not a morning person, and it's just really a drag. It's 5 o'clock, the phone rings, we're gonna kill you, faggot. But I didn't pay too much attention to it because the voices on the phone sounded very young. And I thought, oh, these are just some mixed up boys, and in a couple of years, we'll see them down at the bar. But, some water here. But one day I came home late. It was in May, and we were working on the budget, and my job was to analyze the expenditure on the prison population of California. As you may know, we have more people behind bars in California than any other place in the world. And so I was working late trying to understand the governor's proposal for building more prisons. And as I walked home, I noticed that there were 2 young men sitting on the wall outside of my apartment building. And they sort of glared at me as I walked by, but I didn't pay any attention. It was a very hot night. I was in my suit, and I just wanted to get in my apartment, get out of these clothes, turn on the air conditioner, put on my shorts, and go get some ice cream, which is what I did, and the 2 boys were gone. And I walked about a block and a half, and all of a sudden they were right in front of me. And you always wonder how you're going to respond when you're finally confronted with physical violence on the streets of America. And I did what I thought was correct. You don't make eye contact, you keep walking, don't run, but pick up the pace a little bit. And as we passed, the one that was closest to me said, "There's too many goddamn queers in this town." Now, I was puzzled by that because this was Sacramento, and in my opinion, there were not nearly enough queers in town. I'd been looking all over, but I said nothing and just kept walking, and I thought that they kept walking. But then I heard a sound, and as I turned, they were right there, practically on top of me, and the first one hit me very hard in the back of the neck, hard enough to knock me to the ground. And they spent the next 10 minutes kicking me and beating me and screaming over and over, "Faggot, faggot, faggot." And then one of them came towards me, and I realized he had a knife, and he was going for my throat. And I brought my chin down, and the blade bounced off my chin, and they ran down the street. When I tried to stand up, I realized that the first blow had been with a knife, and that I was bleeding profusely from the back of my neck. And I was able to crawl back to the apartment complex, and there was a big light over the mailboxes, and I was able to get to the mailboxes, but then I had lost too much blood, and I lost consciousness. I woke up in an ambulance. One of my neighbors had realized just before he went to bed that he'd forgotten to pick up his mail, and he went out to get it and saw me there. He called an ambulance. They took me to the hospital. And I did have insurance then. I was insured under this sort of rinky-dink group policy that the Quakers had purchased, ever frugal people. And but under the terms of the insurance policy, I apparently went to the wrong, they called the wrong ambulance company and took me to the wrong hospital. And many years later, I am still getting billed for this adventure, but we can talk about the insurance industry some other time. But I love what Hillary Clinton was saying yesterday. It's absolutely true, and we have to stand up to these people. I was pretty badly injured, but I think the worst of it was that it brought back such a sense of hate, of real hatred of straight people, of heterosexual men in particular, and their seemingly endless capacity for violence, and their celebration of ignorance, and their embrace of ugliness. It made me feel like I was back in high school, getting the shit kicked out of me in gym class again, and having no way to fight back. And I don't, please don't misunderstand, that is not a feeling I want to have. I do not want to feel hate. But I think that all of us have to understand that when we feel fear for too long, it becomes hatred. And I spent most of that summer in physical therapy and trying to deal with the anger and the fear that I felt. I bought a gun, threw it away 2 days later because I couldn't stand the thought that I had a gun in my apartment. But I couldn't dwell on it too much because while I was recovering from the knife attack, my very best friend in the world was dying in Providence, Rhode Island. And his name was Marvin Feldman, and I met him in 1972 when we both got jobs selling Time Life books over the telephone. And I had been working there for about 3 weeks before Marvin started, and I thought, this has got to be the most boring job in the world. So I amused myself by adopting different nom de phones. And I would call people up and I would say, hello, Mrs. Smith, hi, this is Willie Loman calling for Time Life Books in San Francisco. How are you today? I'd like to talk to you about a volume called High Sierra. It's from the American Wilderness Library. And nobody ever got it. I couldn't believe it. And then one day I came to work and I noticed that there was this cute guy in the back row. He had these big blue eyes and curly black hair. And he was just cute. And I got up and I said, hi, this is Willie Loman. And he cracked up in the back. So during the coffee break, I asked him if he wanted to go out. And we had our first date that night. It was a very romantic little spot called The Stud on Folsom Street in San Francisco. And we made out behind the cigarette machine and danced for several hours. And then I asked Marvin if he'd walk me home. When we got to my door, I asked him if he'd like to come in and spend the night with me. And he looked at me and he said, Cleve, I think we're going to be sisters. Don't you hate it when that happens? Just what I need, another friend. But Marvin was right, and I hope that every one of you, no matter how long you live, you'll be lucky if you have one friend like I had. He was always there for me. He was involved with theater, I was involved with politics and activism. He didn't know much about my world, I didn't know anything about his, but whenever Marvin was on stage, I was in the audience, and when I was on stage, he was there. And we traveled together all over the world, we explored New York together, had a wonderful time. He began directing, moved to New York, got his first contract, and was doing very well. I was very frightened to go and see him. And, it's a horrible disease, what it does to our bodies and to our minds. He was a beautiful man. I did not want to see what I knew it had done to his body. He was also brilliant, and so many of my friends ended their lives insane, suffering from dementia, and I couldn't bear the thought of looking into his eyes and not finding him there. I was also frightened of his family. They're devoutly religious. I knew that the rabbi would be there. I did not know how I and the other gay friends would be received. And when I got on the airplane, and this is a trip all of you will make, it may be a very different circumstance, but all of us eventually have to get on a plane or a bus or a train or a plane and say goodbye to somebody that we love very much, that we will never see again. And when I got on that plane from San Francisco, I felt that all I had to bring to Marvin was my own fear of death. But all of that vanished when I walked into Sidney and Esther Feldman's kitchen in Providence, Rhode Island, and smelled the food and felt the love and the dignity of that family. And Marvin was all there. His body was emaciated. He was covered with tumors. He was in great pain, but he stopped taking the morphine the morning that I arrived so that he could be able to talk, and he forced himself up out of bed and sat at the dining room table with us and pretended to eat. And he took me into his room, and I went through his drawers with him and helped him finish the paperwork of his life. And I marveled at the insurance scam he had created to pay for the medical bills so that his mother and father would not lose their home, as so many of our friends' parents had lost their homes to finance the care of their children. And I got to get in bed with him and hold him in my arms, and he told me that it wasn't as bad as he thought, and that he told me not to be frightened. And on October 10th, he closed his eyes and went into a coma, and I went back to San Francisco, and he died while I was on the airplane. And I kind of shut down for a while. Whenever I say this sentence, I wonder if people can even comprehend it. But all my friends died. All of them. And I was in the habit, when people got sick, I always tried to really keep them right up in the front of my awareness. And I would put up pictures in my home of my friends who were sick, pictures from happier times, from parades and parties. And I would try always to think of them and to actively send them my love. But after Marvin, I went home, I took the pictures down, and I felt there was really no way to remember these people that didn't just tear me up. I really wanted to bury the memories along with the people, because there was no way to go on with all of those very sad memories. And one day I was walking up and down Castro Street, and I saw my friend Joseph, with whom I'd been putting up the posters the year before. And I hadn't seen him in a while, and he looked very skinny and kind of gray. And I said, "Joseph, what is it? How are you doing?" And he said, "I don't want to talk about it, but it's time to start the quilt." He'd been working in a theater supply company and had stolen a bunch of fabric, and he brought it up to my house, and we spread it out in the backyard. And I went in the basement and got the big box of spray paint left over from Ronald Reagan's last visit to San Francisco. And we sat there on the lawn and began to make the first two quilts. And I had not allowed myself to really think about Marvin. I couldn't think about Marvin without falling apart. But that day, I did think about him. I thought a lot about him, about his drive and his ambition, his cynicism, his humor, the way he danced, the way he moved, everything about him. And I decided that, as simple as it sounds, really, and you really looked at Marvin Feldman's life, and with what I understood after being with his family during the last days of his life and hearing their stories and their experience of the Holocaust, I realized that just about everything about Marvin Feldman boiled down to the fact that the man was a Jew and he was a homosexual. He was a member of two classes of people that had been subjected to genocide in our parents' time. And this reality, this history, informed every aspect of his character. And in my lame, pathetic attempt to communicate that, I cut triangular stencils, and I spray painted blue triangles and pink triangles, the symbol assigned to homosexuals in the death camps. And I had some of them overlap to form Stars of David. And then I put his name on it, and I stepped back and I looked at it. I thought, this is so ugly. He would hate it. You know, Marvin was so picky, and he would want something that could hang in the window of Bloomingdale's, if not the Museum of Modern Art. And then I looked over at Joseph, and Joseph is the sort of person that I like to describe as a genetic homosexual. He was born to create, born to design. And he's got this big piece of paper, and he has painted this sort of stormy red sunset sky. And I said, "Who are you making this for?" And he told me it was for a choreographer, a man named Ed Mock, a very tall African-American man who organized a multicultural dance troupe for San Francisco kids and brought together Asian kids and Native American kids and Anglo kids and black kids and went to all of the schools. It was a wonderful thing. And he had died early on in the epidemic. So Joseph paints this stormy red sky, and then he opened a pail of gold paint, took off his shoes and socks, dipped his bare feet into the paint, and danced across the panel, leaving these golden footprints on this red sunset sky. And I thought, aha, if nothing else, there are at least enough angry queens with sewing machines out there, and we can make something and we can take it to Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington. And that was what we did. And but the trouble was, I would tell people about this idea, and they would look at me and I don't get it. Now, how big are the patches? And 3 feet by, that's too big. You should do it 3 inches by 6 inches. And they just didn't get it. So Joseph and I decided no one would get it until we made it. And we sat down one night and we made a list of our friends who had died, and we came up with the names of 40 men that we felt we knew well enough to make panels for. And when they were done, we sewed them into these squares. And we had 5 of them, and I went to Dianne Feinstein, who at that time was mayor of San Francisco, and I asked permission to hang these from the mayor's balcony at City Hall during the Lesbian and Gay Pride March. And so that Sunday, people saw it, and they got it. And I didn't know it at the time, but they went home and they started sewing. And every day I would go to the post office on 18th Street. It's an interesting post office. It's where the federal government, in its wisdom, has chosen to place some of the most bitter, homophobic old farts I've ever met. And I would go to the post office and I'd say, is the mail here? And they'd say, oh no. Or maybe on a good day, if I was lucky, there'd be 1 package with a quilt. But one day I went in and I walked in the door, and the first clerk said, oh, it's Mr. Jones. And the second one said, oh, does Mr. Jones want his mail? And the third one said, did you bring a truck? And I said, what are you talking about? And they opened up the doors to the back bin of the post office and began wheeling out these canvas carts on wheels. And they were full of brown paper packages. And I called the office and I said, get a truck down here. And they said, we don't have a truck. And I said, well, get some cars and come down here and help me. And we made an assembly line, and they would pass the packages overhand, and we were tossing them to each other through the post office lobby, out across the sidewalk to 18th Street and into the cars. And as we tossed them, we looked at the postmarks. Here's another one from New York. Here's one from Wyoming. Wyoming? You're crazy. No, look. And here's a big package from Texas. There must be 20 in here. And we were laughing and cheering. And then at one point, everybody just stopped, and there was silence, and we realized that every one of these brown paper packages contained the memories and the love and the rage and the despair of so many who had poured all of this emotion into these pieces of fabric and wrapped them up in brown paper and sent them to some strangers in San Francisco. And they've never stopped coming. And on October 11th, 1987, a year and a day after Marvin died, we unfolded 1,920 quilts on the mall. In my naivete, I believed that morning that the leaders of our nation would see this evidence that we had brought to Washington, and that they would be moved and that they would act. And of course that did not happen, and has not happened, and may not happen. But at that point I believed that it would. And many other people, I think, shared my naive belief in the quilt's power. Because when we got back to San Francisco, there were letters from every city in the country saying, and they were all different letters, but they all began with the same paragraph. You have no idea how bad it is where we live. Can you please bring the quilt? And so we went out, we got a truck, we named her Stella. We found 6 very strong women, and they took that truck, and they took that quilt, and they went out across America and traveled for 4 months, taking the quilt to civic centers and auditorium all over the country. And we went back to Washington a year later, and we had, help me, 8,000 quilts. And we went back the following year with 12, 10. And today we have over 25,000 quilts, and it covers, with the walkways, about 17 football fields. And it's pretty strange for me to watch it grow. I'm very proud of it, but at the last display, this past October, I had written a speech to give at the Lincoln Memorial, and my boyfriend and I went to the quilt during the day when the rain finally stopped, and I tried to walk into it, and I couldn't do it. I tried repeatedly, with Glenn there, holding my hand, and we would walk maybe one square in, and I would feel just sort of overwhelmed, like I was trying to walk through water or something. And we left, and I didn't ever walk into it. We left, and I went back to the hotel, and I ripped up my speech, and felt that I really had to express that for me it is a monstrous thing. And I said on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial that the quilt is an extraordinary burden of truth and beauty and love. But in Washington, D.C., it seems that truth and beauty and love hold very little power. And to me, the quilt, while it connects me to wonderful people all over the country and has created for me a new family and brought into my life new friends and love that I thought would never be a part of my life, it is a damning piece of evidence of our failure as a society, as a people, as a nation. And that is the way I look at it today, even though I am still very proud of it and at times overwhelmed by the beauty of it. The quilt's changed and it's grown. The early panels were almost all for gay men, my age. Today, the names of my friends, Marvin Feldman and Scott Rempel, and the early volunteers of the quilt like Jack Castor and Scott Lago, those names are sewn next to quilts for street kids from Rio de Janeiro, and housewives from New Jersey and Michigan, and farmers from Rwanda, and mine workers from South Africa, prostitutes from Bangkok, teenage girls from New Delhi and Newark. And I hope, as we continue with the Names Project, and as we continue to travel with it, one of the things I hope we can do is help Americans understand the true global context of the AIDS pandemic. And in this country today, even now, we are still so caught up in this notion that this is a gay disease. And we as a country and our medical establishment and our government decided early on that this was a gay American problem and did not need a great deal of attention. And the consequence of that one mistake is that millions of people across this planet have been doomed, and the vast, overwhelming majority of those people are neither gay nor American. We're not a political organization. We don't take a position on legislation or candidates. We have three goals as an organization. First, we seek to illustrate the enormity of the worldwide crisis that is AIDS by revealing something of the lives that are behind the statistics. Secondly, we want to reach out to all the many different kinds of people all over the world whose lives have been invaded by this disease and provide them with a positive and creative means of expression. And this remains very important not only to help people resolve their grief and find the strength to continue the fight, but also to break through the lies and the silence and the hatred that unfortunately still surrounds the epidemic. And finally, we want to provide the whole world with a clear and powerful symbol of a generous and compassionate response to the epidemic. And about the only good news that I can bring to you is that everywhere we go with the quilt, we find, in fact, that ordinary men, women, and children know exactly what they are called upon to do in the face of this health crisis. They find no mystery, no need for debate, no controversy. We say it's really very simple. The sick are to be cared for. The dying are to be comforted. Those who lose loved ones are to be held close to the community. They're not to experience rejection or discrimination or violence. and the full resources available to our society must be brought to bear to educate our people and to find a cure. And it really is that simple. I have one story that I like to close with that these people have probably heard a million times, but I want to stop now, and I hope you have questions or comments. We don't have a large group here, so maybe we can have a talk. Anybody have any questions? Come on. How many of you know someone who has died of AIDS? I was at a campus in Indianapolis 2 weeks ago, and big crowd, about 400 people. I was amazed how many people raised their hands to that question. That is the one thing I ask it, at every audience over the years, and it started out, one hand would go up maybe. One of the things I find frustrating when I talk to campuses and to groups is I usually ask also how many people consider themselves to be members of a high-risk category or kin to someone who is a member of a high-risk category. And as we look at the new statistics from the East Coast cities, everyone has to raise their hand to that question because we've now clearly crossed a threshold, and the fastest high-risk population now is young women. So the average AIDS patient of the 80s, somebody like myself, a gay man from an urban area, that profile is shifting dramatically, and by the end of the century, the average person living with HIV is going to be female, she's going to be African American or Hispanic, and under 21. The quilt is beginning to reflect that change. Come on, I want a question. You guys are sleepy. Yes.
Thank you, Stars.
Thank you.
I have a question, and that is, it seems like this disease just came from nowhere. It seems like that there's resistance from the government to help. And I've heard from Frank Zappa and Stingfish Tate and a couple other people that there's a theory that maybe this thing was created for population control. What are your comments on that?
Well, early on, there were a lot of theories. About the same time that the epidemic started, gay bars began installing ionizers in their ceilings to help dispel the smoke. And I remember people looking at those things and saying, what do they really do? It also occurred right after the hepatitis studies, in which large numbers of sexually active gay men in urban centers were recruited to contribute blood for the creation of the vaccine. There's also been a lot of speculation that it would have been created by the CIA or some other government agency. I think all of these really, and believe me, I'm not up here to defend any federal agency, but I think that a lot of these attitudes really are rooted in our lack of experience with epidemics, because most of us in this room are part of a generation that only might barely remember polio, but certainly not the great influenza epidemics that ravaged this country in the early part of the century. We don't have that experience. Our experience has been that there were no problems that could not be solved by modern medicine and technology. And so when we finally did encounter an organism that could not be contained, we thought, oh, could it really be just a lowly organism that did this? It had to be humankind. So I don't subscribe to any of the conspiracy theories for the origin of the disease. I think that the spread of the disease and the lack of response, I mean, there's been nothing covert about that. In the corridors of power, they said, let them die. And they did nothing. And many of them celebrated the suffering that resulted. But I was one of the sexually active gay men who spent the 70s traveling around the world. I had a great time, and I have no trouble understanding how a disease could emerge and move very rapidly. I'd also say, though, that we've also been a little bit I think, deflected by the course, the sort of odd course that the disease has taken. We're very much focused on these flashpoints that occurred among homosexual men, drug users within the Western world. And I really believe that when the final history of this epidemic is written, that what happened to my brothers and what happened to IV drug users and hemophiliacs are going to be seen really as kind of flukes of society and nature, because these produced these flashpoints that we all focused on, but really the main body of the epidemic was moving more slowly but inexorably through a much larger population that did not get the attention because we don't care about another million dead in Africa. So I don't subscribe to the conspiracy theories of the origin of it. Anyone else? Yes?
Yeah, actually, I'd kind of like to pose the question to everyone here as well. Maybe by a show of hands, who saw the musical that was here last semester? Telling the story of the quilt?
Oh, really?
I was wondering if you were aware of that. It was a musical quilt which originated here last semester, and I think towards for a competition in New York. I'm not in the theater department, I forget. So if somebody else here is, maybe they could.
A musical?
You're not. I was wondering if you were aware of it.
No, I know there's a symphony, and there's poetry and films, but I've never heard of a musical.
That's really surprising because it's a really good work, and I think in fact it won at the university competition when it went up to New York, and I understand that there's still talk of it being staged professionally.
Cool.
When it was beginning here at school, I kind of thought, oh, I hope this isn't some second-rate production that is very well intentioned, but somehow loses the message along the way. And it was really incredible. I thought.
My family gets such a kick out of these things. People are always sending my mother and father clippings and reviews of things. And I got last Christmas, she wrote back and she listed all of the, sort of the posters and the songs and the poems and the books and things. And then at the Christmas dinner table, they were making jokes about who was going to portray me in the movies, and my mother suggested Sally Fields. I said I would prefer to go with someone a little more masculine, like Sigourney Weaver, maybe. Any other questions? Mm-hmm.
My knowledge of AIDS is very limited, but I read somewhere that when the HIV virus enters somebody's body, the body produces antibodies. I was wondering, is there a vaccine, and would it be helpful?
One of the current, for those of you who couldn't hear, she was asking about the possibility of a vaccine. Yeah, the body does produce antibodies. It produces a very high level of antibodies at first, and then gradually as the disease progresses, the virus wins, and the antibodies are not sufficient to drive it away. But they have found that even with people who have severely compromised immune systems, that there does seem to be evidence that injection of portions of the virus envelope can stimulate a further response. And there's a lot of research going on in this area, actually. There's GP120, GP160 are two that were very widely touted about a year ago, but don't seem to be panning out. There is always hope, and I'm absolutely convinced they will find something. I don't know if I'm going to be here for it, and it's so slow that it makes you crazy. You also have a situation where the politics of research funding have gotten really kind of bizarre around this issue, in particular the GP160, where you had a manufacturing company that really has spent more money on lobbyists than on biomedical research, but they've been quite successful. So yeah, that's one of the areas that they're working on, but there's been no real progress thus far. Yeah, is there someone back there? Mm-hmm.
I just want to thank you for coming. And also, I want to know if you could give advice to a future physician. What would you tell them? Advice how to respond to an AIDS patient, how to treat an AIDS patient. What would be your advice?
You know, I'm often asked questions by people who are either medical professionals or studying to be that about what kind of special concerns should they have. And, you know, I think the main thing that I look for, and my friends, when we talk about our frustration with the doctors, and there's a lot of frustration out there, you know, we want people to be matter of fact. We want people to be honest with us. And we want to know that they are caring for us without judgment. We want them to know that they understand something about us and our community. And we want to know that you're doing your work and keeping up on what's happening. But for me, the main thing I want from a medical professional or anybody, and I've said this to my family, is I don't want to be written off. Don't assume I'm going to die of AIDS. Please. Because I'm still healthy and I'm still strong and I'm still trying to struggle along and understand all of these words you're using and reading the literature. And don't assume I'm going to die. Don't write me off. And this also extends to people like our new AIDS czar, who is very much interested in prevention and education. And that's fine. It's important. But it's not the whole story, because there are millions of people like me who are already infected, and prevention and education isn't going to do anything to save us. So we want to see that commitment to the biomedical research. We want to see that commitment to keeping people alive. And I've dealt with a lot of doctors over the years who just write us off right at the beginning. You know, the first problem, and that is really demoralizing. I think that's getting better, but it is still a problem. Absolutely, yeah.
After hearing the medical, how do you feel about the government politics towards their actions?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
How do you feel about, after hearing the medical, how do you feel about the government and politics actions?
Are we talking about the Clinton administration? You know, I had this boyfriend for a while. His name was Glenn. And this past election, November, I was also running for the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in the same election. And about a week before, we did a poll and we realized that I wasn't going to make it. And so my boyfriend, very sweet, decided that he would rent me a hotel suite downtown and that we would watch the results from a luxury hotel suite downtown. And it was very nice. I lost my election. But he held me in his arms and we watched Clinton's victory. And I felt, you know, okay, I lost my election, but thank God Bill Clinton won, because now I've got a chance to live. And, you know, it's sort of like my boyfriend. I felt really good with him election night, but he never called back. And Bill Clinton has said nothing. And he has done nothing. And I'm very dismayed by what happened with the gays in the military, because I think this was a battle that the gay community did not choose, or if we did choose it, it was a poor choice. And I think that Clinton got burned by the military experience, and there has been not one word since about AIDS. I'm very appreciative of their efforts in health reform. I think Hillary Clinton is doing a great job. I watched the president on that Nightline town hall, and I thought, you know, he was awesome in his command of the issues and the rest of it, but they are not talking about AIDS, and they are not talking in any kind of realistic way about increasing the federal commitment to the basic research necessary. So I'm very dismayed and disheartened. I survived 12 years under Reagan and Bush. I don't want Bill Clinton to kill me. Anybody else? Yeah.
In the 1980s, was the popular public response to AIDS was revulsion. In the 1990s, it seems that it's becoming acceptance almost to the point of passive tolerance. So how do we keep AIDS from becoming just another disease that people are willing to accept from the number of medical diseases?
I think this is a man who's tired of red ribbons. Yeah, I don't know. The progress from revulsion to compassion, though, has been remarkable, and I really see it at the quilt displays. The early quilt displays were attended almost exclusively by gay men, lesbian women, and their close friends. And quilt displays today are family events, and you see entire families and all different kinds of people attending them. And I don't expect everybody to make it their top priority, but what I feel like we're losing in this is the sense that bold action could still save millions of lives. And the other thing that's happened that I think goes along with this is that the radical edge that sort of led the fight for a long time has burnt out, died, or moved on. And part of this, I think, has to do with the Clinton election, that the organized gay political groups and the AIDS activist community really bought into the Clinton campaign and really felt on election day that we had overcome the most serious obstacle, that we would now have real leadership from the White House. So I think we've somehow lost this urgency and edge, and we need to get that back. And also, most people don't know what the hell to do. They don't know what they can do. And it's another area where the leadership is lacking. We are not focused. We're not keeping our troops out there in the street where we need them. Anybody else? Yeah.
One thing you should know, it hasn't been publicized yet. President Clinton White House has distributed a memo to every cabinet officer requiring them to educate federal employees on AIDS, in conjunction with AIDS Education Day. And besides the usual lectures on AIDS and how to get it, the message talks about prevention and compassion for people who have HIV virus and AIDS. Hasn't been released yet to the press, but this
Actually, I think we're shipping quilt sections to all the cabinet offices. I think I just heard that in New Orleans at the conference. Anybody else? Yeah.
I want to first thank you for coming here.
Thank you.
My question is, you advocate the use of marijuana to release the
Yes. We all laugh at it because it's pot, and now there's this movie out, Dazed and Confused. But my experience, and I mean, personally, I was very sick this spring with a parasitic infection that I lost 20 pounds in about 3 weeks, and I thought I was dying. And when I started to get better, the medication was also horrible. And so basically for about 4 months, I was nauseated constantly. And the only thing that helped at all was marijuana. I found that if I got up usually it was worse in the morning. And you know how it is when you start the day and you can't eat, you just get progressively worse during the course of the day, and it becomes harder and harder to try and eat. But I found that even a very small amount really improved the appetite. I think it also helps people deal with stress. I do not believe it's a depressant. A lot of my friends, go out and have a drink. That's not what I want to do, because I think that's a depressant. And I think it helps with the stress. It clearly helps with nausea and with pain relief. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that virtually every long-term survivor I know smokes marijuana regularly. There, I said it. and we do inhale. $20 a gram, you better inhale. Anybody? Yes.
I saw the film Common Threads today, and I just wanted to thank you for starting the film, because I think it gives people a way of focusing their grief in a positive manner, and a way of giving them some sort of closure to something that they have never seen before.
Thank you. That was a beautiful movie. I had the privilege of attending the Oscars awards ceremony when we won for Best Documentary. It was really cool because I got in the elevator and there was Arnold Schwarzenegger, Diana Ross, Jessica Tandy, and Tom Hanks. And I was so overwhelmed that I stepped back and I stepped right on Jessica Tandy's foot. She smacked me with her purse. But yeah, it's beautiful. But I also feel awkward. I had the idea, but I did not do the work. I still do not know how to sew. And the quilt has happened because people who were moved by it made a commitment to it. And the family of people who make the displays happen and do the work and have the quilting bees, and it is a lot of work. I mean, there's a lot of just physical, sweaty, boring labor involved with it. Ask any of the people right here. You know, and I'm very grateful for these folks, and I feel really connected to them and amazed by it, because I get on an airplane and I fly into a city and I go to, and there's this big civic center and there's 400 people I've never seen before, dressed in white, getting ready to unfold the quilt, and it's pretty remarkable. Anybody else? Yeah.
This is a global problem, and I think this is a wonderful project, and I was just wondering how governments in other countries are dealing with this, especially Africa. That's incredible, how people look at the AIDS.
Well, I think as we look, the question for those who could not hear was, you know, what are the responses from other governments and other countries around the world? And Jonathan Mann and his colleagues at Harvard have just put out a very thick volume about the global epidemic and its effect in different societies, different countries. I think a simplistic response to your question is that there's basically two situations. We have the Western developed countries where AIDS continues to be marginalized and seen almost entirely as a gay problem. And then we have the developing nations where AIDS is just one more incredible burden added to a healthcare system that has no money. And when you look in Africa in particular, but also in India and Pakistan and Thailand, you see a situation where there simply are no additional resources. And the World Health Organization has been able to play some role in encouraging governments to respond. But you know, when I said earlier that Americans need to understand the true global context of the disease, we also need to understand our responsibility in the West to make sure that when that happy day comes, that a cure is found, it's not just for white men in North America and Europe, that these will be treatments that will be available worldwide. And when we look at the situation now, I think there's great cause for pessimism. It's spreading rapidly. In Africa and in Southeast Asia and in India, it is, of course, almost entirely heterosexual transmission. That's one thing that Americans have a little bit of trouble understanding, why it would be primarily a gay population affected in this country. And a lot of that just has to do with the physiology of the disease and the fact that in the West, with its very high standards of health care, the transmission from male to female, from female to male is less likely. But in these countries where there is no budget for public health, where there's lots and lots of other health problems, it makes it easy, it facilitates easier transmission from female to male. So we see a 50-50 male-female patient population in those countries. Anybody else? Yes.
For all the people that died in Minnesota City, what's it actually going to take for the government and the establishment to wake up and say, we can't let this go on anymore and do something?
I don't know. There's been a number of meetings and conversations that have been going on around the country within the research community of trying to find ways to consolidate the research effort, to try and minimize the absurd competitive spirit that exists between the different research facilities, to try and get the pharmaceuticals to share their information. In the early days, we used to joke that there would be a race for the Nobel Prize and that these researchers' egos would save us from destruction because they wanted the Nobel Prize. Well, I think the prime motivator today is money. And we are, seeing a great deal of investment in the companies that are pursuing the vaccines and the other treatments. But we also see that these people, of course, do not share their information. So there's an enormous amount of replication that is unnecessary and, just lack of sharing of information that is, I think, one of the biggest hindrances we face. So, ACT UP has pretty much dissolved around the country, but the ACT UP treatment committees largely have remained. And there are a lot of really bright, dedicated treatment activists out there, but it's very frustrating, and I think we've sort of lost the momentum in terms of the political lobbying that needs to go on. Yeah.
Here we have this age risky behavior. I mean, what can we do about that?
Well, you know, I talk to a lot of high school groups, and any of you who associates with teenagers, you know, they are all immortal. There's nothing you can do about it. They're immortal, and they don't believe it. So I think the quilt helps a little bit because they look at the birth and death dates, and they realize that a great many of the people in the quilt were infected while they were still in high school. That helps a bit. There's a more sinister aspect to this question, though, which is we see within the gay male population that a study done by the San Francisco AIDS Foundation showed that young gay kids moving to the city did not know, were not educated, and those who were educated often did not respect themselves enough to heed the warning. And when I read the summary of this report, I got very depressed because I thought, my God, 20 years of gay liberation, 20 years of an organized, visible gay and lesbian movement, and we still have a whole new generation of gay and lesbian kids who hate themselves, and we are going to lose them, and AIDS will just be one. We will lose many to suicide, to alcoholism, to drugs. So when I go to high schools, like one thing I do now is I kick the boys out. I give the basic sort of AIDS 101 rap, and I kick the boys out because I notice that the girls won't ask questions when the boys are in the room because the boys are making fag jokes. And I say to the girls, you know why they're doing that, don't you? You know? And the girls go, we know what their problem is. But most high schools, when I ask for questions, there'll be maybe 3 or 4 boys that will ask either something smart or something flip, and the girls just sit there with these worried looks on their faces, and I know they're having sex. So I kick the boys out and I say, okay, girls, we got to talk, and we've got to use words like penis and vagina, and with the boys, you know, and then I explain to them why they are at greater risk, why it is easier for the virus to penetrate the walls of the vagina than for it to enter the man's penis. And I explain it to them. And then they start talking, and then they start asking questions. And it's amazing to me, the questions, because they all indicate that they are sexually active, that they are frightened of AIDS, and that they are not protecting themselves. And I say to them, you know, you got to value your body a little bit more than that. And the guys right now, they want one thing, basically, which is you on your back, and you have got to stand up for it. And it may not be fair and it may not be right, but it's girls and young women who are going to have to enforce the new rules. And I try to, you know, just give them that pep talk, but the pressure they're under is enormous. And it's frightening to me. And then when you add that to the fact that gay men are still engaging in high-risk behavior, and when you do the focus groups, the things that they hear people saying are, well, if everybody I know is going to die, why do I want to stay? I've probably already been infected. My family's disowned me. I have no money. I have no job. I have no education. I'm selling my butt on the street. You know, so I hate the expression self-esteem because it's just so, you know, cliched right now, but it's a whole lot of the problem. People need to respect themselves, need to love themselves, need to value their lives and understand that their lives are worth fighting for. And it frightens me when I hear from the high school girls in particular just how willing they are to risk their lives. Anybody else? Yeah.
I was just on top of when you talk about the lack of recognition that AIDS has, and how you have, you know, all these quilts, these panels that get, you know, show evidence and stuff. But one thing, last semester I was studying in Israel, and one thing that really moved me was there's a day, one day of the year is called Memorial Day, and it's where twice that day a siren goes off. Everybody stops, and the buses stop, the cars stop, people get out of the street, people in the stores all come on the street, and everyone just stands there for 10 seconds, or actually no, it's longer than that, it's about a minute, and it's for the remembrance of soldiers who have died fighting for the country and just in the army and things like that. And I was just wondering if something like that could ever be put into effect for AIDS.
Well, we try to do that with World AIDS Day, but I think that what you're describing has a lot to do with what we try to do with the quilt. You're describing a country where all of the citizens of that country know that they are required to defend their lives. And it gives them a certain solidarity and a certain understanding that they're all in this together. It reminds me of when I was a kid in Pennsylvania, and the river broke through the banks, and everybody was out there and with the sandbags, and it didn't matter whether you were a Jew or a Catholic or a Republican or a Democrat, you were there in line. But we still don't have that sense that the whole country is affected, that all of our children are affected, that all of our families are going to lose someone to this disease. And I think we're still a ways off from that. Jonathan Mann, Harvard AIDS Institute. I'm not sure what you're talking about. There are two, and I think now a third type of antibody test. And the first one that was developed was fairly accurate. The second was more accurate, and the third is even better. But I think maybe what you're referring to now is the ability to monitor viral activity within the body and get a better sense of whether people who are infected are getting to the point where the disease is going to start overtaking them.
I don't know what I heard. I'm always for a second.
Sorry. Anybody else? Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for a psychotherapist in dealing with AIDS victims?
Well, don't call us victims. You can call me a victim after I'm dead. That's fine. But I think for people in the support services, it's really important that you educate yourself and that you put yourself, not only figuratively but literally, within that community. And if it's difficult to offer appropriate assistance and advice to people you don't understand. So I think that people need to spend time, not just professional time, but volunteer with these groups, stuff envelopes, go to the marches, hang out with people, have a beer with people, get to know people in their homes, and see them not just as a client, but let them know that you feel solidarity. We're not all that different. But there are some differences that can be quite significant in attitude and perspectives, and just involve yourself in it. Also be aware that among gay people, of course, there is a deep and very well justified suspicion and hostility towards psychotherapists, psychologists, and psychiatrists. So don't be surprised when you encounter it. Yeah.
I just want to thank you, Mr. Jones, and everyone else for coming out tonight. We have time for one, maybe two more questions. Otherwise, we have a reception where everyone's invited right behind us in the Grand Ballroom Lounge.
Thank you. I want to take one more question, and I want to close with a little anecdote. Yes?
I was wondering how the whole ritual
That's the first question I really liked. The question was, how did the whole ritual of the unfolding of the quilt evolve? I don't know. How many of you have seen a quilt display with the unfolding? Basically, we take 4 of these 12 by 12s, and we link them together with these cable ties on the edge so that we get a square that's 24 by 24. And then we take the corners and fold them in over and over until we get this little bundle. And when I had the idea, I was living in a place that had a parquet floor, just like what you see here. And I was thinking, how could they be sewn in? And I came up with the idea of the 12 by 12 square with the 8 panels in each one. So we had that. Before we brought in other people, we had the basic idea that it would be sewn into these squares. And then this motley crew of people walked into my life and said they would help me do this. I'd never met any of them before, and none of us had ever done anything like this. And we spent many nights sitting around, drinking wine, trying to come up with a dignified, simple, logistically feasible way of handling it and unfolding it. And a man named Jack Castor, who was one of the most wonderfully funny, sweet men I've ever met, came in one day and he said, well, I was up all night thinking about it, and I've got an idea. And he called it the Lotus Fold. And the idea was that we would lay out the walkways. These 24-foot by 24-foot squares are separated by canvas or plastic walkways that go through it, because we wanted everybody to be able to get close enough to touch every single quilt. And so Jack came up with this idea of folding it up into a bundle and then just unfolding it so it would just sort of blossom open and fill the squares made by the walkway grid. So we got this all worked out. We get to Washington, D.C. on October 11th, 1987. The walkways are all laid out. The quilt bundles are placed within each square. And when it came time for the first unfolding team to walk out there dressed in white, we picked white because we wanted the people to be distinguishable, but we also wanted them to sort of blend into the walkways. And the first walkways were off-white, so people standing in white on the walkways would be visible but wouldn't distract you from the quilt itself. Later, we also thought it reminded us of nurses, and we like the nurses. They work hard, and they've got a lot of love in their hearts, and they've just been so great. So we get there, and the first unfolding team begins to pull it out, and they realize that we've positioned it wrong. And so the squares, the corners of the square now come out over the walkway instead of just fitting into the square. So the people in that first unfolding team lifted it up, and it billowed, and we all went, oh my God, it's beautiful. And then they moved it around to fit into the square. And so in every display of the quilt in this country and around the world, that first mistake that we made in '87 has been repeated. And it's very beautiful, and it reminds me of shaking out the quilt before you put it on the bed. So, okay, so I get to shut up now. I want to close with just a short story about a lady that I met very, very briefly and have never seen since. But I think for me it really illustrates the power of the quilt, and also what it's done for me in my life. When we got back to San Francisco after the first tour around the United States, we were able to do a large display at the George Moscone Civic Auditorium in San Francisco. This is, of course, named after the mayor who was murdered back then in '78 with Harvey Milk. And we were all down at the display. It was an enormous display, and all of the workshop was empty. All of the volunteers were down at the display. And after everything got going, I felt really kind of overwhelmed, and I left. I wanted to go back to the workshop and have some time by myself in the workshop. And I was sitting in the back, just trying to catch up with my correspondence. And I got this strange feeling that I was being stared at, sort of back of the neck sensation. And I turned and looked across the room and through our big storefront windows, and I saw there on Market Street an old woman standing, looking in. And she was an African-American woman in her late 70s or early 80s, very small. She was wearing a blue dress. And I saw her just standing there, and she just stood and looked in the door. So I went to the door and I opened it up and I asked her if she wanted to come in. And she wouldn't look at me and she wouldn't say anything, and she kept her arms tightly crossed and she walked around. She looked at some quilts that had come in too late to be included in the display. She picked up some of the educational material that we had on the counter, and then without saying a word, she left. Several days passed, and the quilt display ended, and everybody was back in the workshop. The big stacks of fabric, the sewing machines were going, the radio was on. There were people in one corner crying, people in another corner laughing, the usual hubbub. And again, I got the sense that somebody was staring at me. And I looked through the window and I saw the same woman standing on the sidewalk, looking through the windows. She was wearing the same blue dress, had the same frown on her face, her arms tightly crossed, but I saw there was a piece of fabric in her arms. And she came in and she told me that she had traveled by herself on a Greyhound bus from a small town in Kentucky, and that a year before, her oldest son had come home from Los Angeles very ill, and she had cared for him alone in her little house in their little town without ever revealing to another human being the nature of her son's disease. And those of you who have cared for someone with HIV know that it is a horrible struggle. It is a lot of work. And this lady cared for her son without any assistance from anyone else until it came time for him to die. And she took him to the county hospital and stayed with him, sat next to his bed for the last 3 days of his life. And then he died. And she told me that she left the hospital and walked back to her house, and that when she opened the front door, she looked across the living room and saw her son's bedroom door standing open, and saw the hospital bed and the bedpan and the IV drip. And she said she saw that, and she went and she closed the door and she locked it and had never opened that door again. Many months passed, and she was at a dentist office waiting for an appointment, and she picked up a back issue of People magazine and read a story about the quilt. And she went home and she packed her bags and she got on a Greyhound bus, this old woman, and traveled across the United States to the corner of Castro and Market Street in San Francisco. And she told me this story, and then she handed me the piece of fabric that was in her arms and said, "This is my son. I'm going to go home now and clean out his room." And I felt very proud at that point that we in San Francisco, who were mainly young and white and gay, had found this vehicle, this message that had traveled across the country and found this old black woman alone with her grief in the hills of Appalachia and connected her and her son and their struggle and their love with all of us, all over the world, men and women of every age, race, and background, who must now finally understand that if we do not stand together, we will fail and we will die. I think that's the message of the quilt, and I don't know what happened to that old lady. I've never heard from her again, but I think of her almost every day and hope she is well. And I want to thank you all for showing up tonight on this cold night, and it's very good to see all of you from Washington. Thanks for coming up. I appreciate it. And thank you. Thank you.